Bienvenue à
Welcome to this meeting, to the meeting number 96 of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. I want to welcome everyone. Today we are conducting a hybrid meeting pursuant to the standing orders using Zoom, while public health authorities and the Board of Internal Economy no longer require mask wearing indoors or on the precinct. Masks and respirators are still excellent tools to prevent the spread of COVID-19 and are encouraged. I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants that screenshots and taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. So please be very careful with your earpieces. Make sure that they are not near a mic that is on. And I would like to thank the interpreters here with us for the meeting. And we will, of course, be working in both official languages. The first part of this meeting will be the Order in Council appointment of Catherine Tate as the new president of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She will make a presentation and we will be able to ask questions. Barbara Williams is with her, the Executive Vice President of CBC, and Danny Malul, the Interim Executive Vice President for Radio-Canada. Welcome. Ms. Tate, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to meet with you today. As you noted, I have with me the two leaders of CBC and Radio-Canada to help me answer any questions you have.
This motion states that this invitation is to discuss my mandate following my reappointment. I feel it is important to start by clarifying that the President and CEO of CBC Radio-Canada does not receive her mandate from the government. As many of you know, CBC Radio-Canada, as an independent Crown corporation, has its mandate set out in law, in the Broadcasting Act. It is to provide, and I quote, services incorporating a wide range of programming that informs, enlightens, and entertains. That law also protects the corporation's, and I quote, freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence. I mention this because that independence is essential to our existence. It marks the fundamental difference between a public broadcaster that serves citizens and a state broadcaster that serves the government. CBC Radio-Canada is accountable to the public. And I mention this because I'm concerned by some views expressed that the power of a parliamentary committee could be used to summon employees who make day-to-day decisions about our journalism. Political interference in journalism is precisely why the Broadcasting Act protects journalistic independence in law. As President and CEO, I'm also responsible to parliamentarians for CBC Radio-Canada, and that is why I'm here today. The heads of CBC and Radio-Canada are here with me to provide accountability to you and to Canadians without threatening that independence. I trust you will support me in that effort. I'm proud to be able to lead this public media service that touches the lives of Canadians every day. The public money invested in CBC Radio-Canada not only ensures that everyone can get the best quality news and information in the country, but also the very best in Canadian drama, comedy, music, podcasts, and so much more. Before we take your questions, let me tell you about a few of the priorities for my second term as President and CEO, developed with the support of our Board of Directors. The first is the launch of the National Indigenous Strategy at CBC Radio-Canada. This is a first for us, a first strategy developed and led by Indigenous employees and leaders in concert with Indigenous advisors, stakeholders, and communities. A first framework for the public broadcaster to deliver on its promise to serve all Canadians and all Indigenous peoples. Ma deuxième priorité est d'assurer une place de...
My second priority is to ensure the importance of the public broadcaster in our news ecosystem as well as our creative sector, especially as the CRTC considers how to implement the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act.
Work to secure recognition of journalists as essential to the protection of our democracy. Journalists are disproportionately targeted by online harm and physical attacks on a global scale. Enfin, il y a beaucoup à faire.
Finally, there is much to do to prepare CBC Radio-Canada for an uncertain future. We are experiencing the same challenges as other media in Canada and around the world. The fierce competition of the global giants have upended our domestic industry in news and entertainment programming.
On trust, earning, maintaining, and building trust. And we will do this by doubling down on our strengths: proximity, relevance, and inclusion. This issue of public trust is the most important priority of all. It's an issue every Western democracy is facing, and one that all my public broadcasting counterparts are committed to addressing, because a strong public media is undeniably one of the most important tools a country has for building trust. So in brief, those are my current priorities, and with that, I welcome your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Tate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tate, and we will now go to questions. I would just say to our members that, as a reminder, when you just have 30 seconds, not 30 minutes, as I mistakenly said, I will show this card, and I would ask you to take note of that. So just to see whether you have time left, you can always ask me. So I just want that to be clear. The first turn is for Mr. Berthold, and I understand you're going to share your time with Ms. Landsman. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Tate, I want to take this first opportunity to ask you an important question. I am a proud Beauce resident. I'm proud of my heritage. Do you find my accent difficult to understand? No, not at all. Then why has the CBC decided to turn its back on the Quebec accent and use people without with a different accent? Well, Mr. Chairman, through you, I immediately called the head of the Quebec Artists Union, and I apologized for using a non-Quebec actor for the role that you mentioned, and we have corrected that practice. Thank you. Thank you, and I will give the floor to Ms. Landsman.
You mentioned in your opening comments that public trust was the most important, so I want to speak to this motion. On October 17th, the CBC published a false headline based on dangerous disinformation that incorrectly stated that Israel was responsible for the explosion at the hospital in Gaza that resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians. And if you don't have it, I have it right here. That is the headline. It says, hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on Gaza City Hospital, Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza says. And that was since changed, if you don't have this, to Palestinians say hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on hospital. Israel blames Islamic Jihad. This still lives on the CBC website. So this headline, it's still there. It remains on the website. And I would hope that you would agree with me that, in fact, the Palestinian Health Authority is controlled by Hamas. I think that is a fact. The Prime Minister, the Minister of National Defense, the United States, the British and French governments all have definitively said that the attack did not come from Israel. So why won't the CBC?
If I may bring the members' attention to the facts and correct the record. CBC first reported on the terrifically horrific attack or a bomb in the hospital in the Gaza Strip based on an Associated Press report that is a trusted source of news for us. You'll notice if you go to cbc.ca or radiocanada.ca, we often use news feeds from other trusted, reputable news organizations. And we sourced and we cited the source of that information, as Madam Landsman has just pointed out. 90 minutes later, when we received the corrected information, we also updated the site. I just would like to say, we stand behind our journalism. In conflicts and in war, news comes at a very fast rate, and people are claiming on both sides of the story. Our journalists on the ground and in our newsrooms are obliged to measure and take account.
I appreciate that's an Associated Press article, and your mandate is to, you are responsible to Canadians. It's $1.4 billion of taxpayer money. But you said that that you stand by the statement. Palestinians say hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on Israel hospital. Israel blames Islamic Jihad. That still exists. It is a headline that has been debunked by governments across the world, including even our own Prime Minister, albeit 7 days late. So I want to know if you'll apologize to Jewish Canadians. I want to know if you'll apologize to Canadians. And I want to know when we can expect a retraction from CBC.
Mr. President, I will, Mr. Chair, Monsieur le Président, I will not apologize because the journalism is among the finest in the world. Our journalists operate in an independent fashion, independent of management, independent of the board of directors, and independent of government and political influence. They are guided by the journalistic standards and practices, and I invite any member and any Canadian to refer to these practices on our website. They are transparent and they are public, and if you have a concern, anyone has a concern with our journalism, I invite you to address it to the independent ombudsman en français ou en anglais in order to have them independently investigate and review the application of our journalism.
I understand that you're not going to apologize for printing disinformation, but how can the CBC, who's committed to truth, who's committed to standards, not call Hamas terrorists? We saw a leaked memo from the Director of Journalistic Standards, that's Mr. Achi, who sent a directive to journalists for saying not using to not use or describe Hamas as a terrorist group. You do agree, it is fact that that Hamas has been listed as a terrorist organization in 2002 in this country, correct?
I will address the issue as follows, Mr. Chair. And I think there's a fantastic blog by our head of news, Brodie Fenlon, which you can refer to. He does this very often to comment on making journalism transparent, explaining to Canadians how we do the journalism. And in the case of attribution, this is a policy that we have had at CPC Radio-Canada for over several decades. It is shared and mirrored by many other reputable news organizations, including the Globe and Mail, the BBC, Agence France Presse, Reuters, and any number of other agencies. So I would just say the attribution, we use the word terrorist and terrorism and acknowledge that Canada, the UK, and the US consider Hamas a terrorist organization, but we, as journalists, do not make that attribution.
Merci, Madame Landsman. Madame Landsman, merci. Votre temps est écoulé. Vous aurez l'occasion de vous reprendre un prochain.
Thank you. Your time is up, Ms. Landsman. We will now go to the Liberals. We have Ms. Hippner for 6 minutes.
And thank you to our witnesses for being here today to explain the journalism process to people at this committee. And I'll go back to your last point, because people keep saying that this was a leaked directive from the CBC, but in fact it was just a note pointing to the CBC style guide, which, as you mentioned, is in accordance with other journalism organizations which have style guides. Could you maybe explain in a little bit more detail to this committee why we have style guides in journalism and how they help journalists be more independent, or be more, you know what I'm trying to say?
So thank you for the question. The journalistic standards and practices have been developed over many years. They are under regular review. With social media and different things changing in our industry, we have to constantly make sure that they are up to date. But they are founded on 5 critical principles: impartiality, fairness, balance, integrity, and accuracy. And these are absolutely fundamental, and they are common to CBC and Radio-Canada newsrooms, and they inform everything we do. Today is our annual public meeting. I have to mention that Adrienne Arsenault, in a clip, said the most moving thing I've ever heard. She said, of all the journalistic practices, it is integrity that informs everything our journalists do. The integrity speaks to balancing the impact of a story, trying to understand the source, trying to make sure that we acknowledge source, and to be as fair as possible so that Canadians receive the best possible information, the fact-based information, and they can then judge the news as they see fit. So to the question of how does that work, I've had the privilege, I'm not a journalist, I was a producer before I had the privilege of serving in this role, and I've had the honor of witnessing an assignment room at CBC Radio-Canada, and that's where every morning across this country, 80 stations, managing editors sit down with their teams, journalists, producers, researchers, and they talk about the news, fast-breaking news, hard issue news, investigative news, international news, and they discuss and balance and consider, and that's where the integrity comes in. They determine what they feel they must be focusing on that particular day.
And I listen to CBC coverage all the time, and I hear regularly CBC say Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by Canada. It's simply that the journalist isn't making that distinction.
Correct.
Right?
The determination is, as mirrored in other news organizations, is that the word is extremely politically charged, and if journalists use the word, it causes them to enter into a debate that is not our business. Our business is to remain independent and fact-based.
And you mentioned, I mean, you're the head of CBC as a whole, so you really don't have any say in the newsroom. Well, I worked in many newsrooms, and management is, there's a line that separates management from the newsroom. So
Absolutely.
You're not part of those conversations in the
No,
morning,
absolutely
are you?
not. No, and in fact, it's not only that we have an independence from government by the Broadcasting Act, then we have an independence from the board of directors, that is an oversight role. Then there is this team that you see in front of you, and we have an oversight role, but we have, and then there is the journalism, and the journalism is entirely independent. It's extremely important for Canadians to understand there are 3 layers of independence. We do not interfere or direct or try to influence the news.
And so how did you feel? I'm sure you were kept apprised of this committee and the last few meetings we had. How did you feel about politicians or members of this committee trying to tell CBC how to tell the news, how to tell the stories, and what words to use?
Well, very honestly, I'm disturbed. I am disturbed by political interference. I worry about our journalists. We're living in a world where the World Freedom Press Index, in its annual survey, they've been conducting this survey for many years, concluded that over 80% of the population on this planet is living under authoritarian regimes where there is limited to no press freedom or independence. We are the minority. This is a precious asset. This independent journalism is the pillar of our democracy. If we try to influence on any side of any particular debate, we are threatening the fundamental building block of this country's democracy. And that's why I speak with the level of passion that I do today about this subject.
And how would you say CBC journalists reacted to hearing a parliamentarian accuse the CBC of being on the side of Hamas?
Again, I do not speak to the journalists about how they feel or react. I respect their independence. I can only imagine that they are concerned, and mostly because we have spectacular teams on the ground in Israel right now who are putting their lives in danger, bringing the news back to Canadians. So any conversation that foments division or a suggestion that they are on one side of a war puts them in danger.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Heffner.
Thank you very much, Ms. Landsman. So usually it would be now the turn of the Bloc Québécois, but since the only Bloc member is chairing, then I would move again to the Conservative for 6 minutes, and I may have questions after that. I'm not it doesn't bother me if you'd like to ask your questions right now. Please go ahead. Mr. Julian.
This important discussion. As you cited, and I think Ms. Heffner asked that question, a Conservative member of this committee stated in the most irresponsible and incendiary way possible that CBC journalists were on the side of terrorists. She has not apologized. She has not in any way taken responsibility for those appalling comments. I note that 33 journalists or members of the media have been killed so far in Israel and Gaza, covering the conflict, the war. You mentioned in your opening statement about the issue of physical safety of your journalists. Do comments like that in any way, do you feel that they contribute to an environment where journalist safety may be put in peril?
Absolutely, Mr. Julian. The reality is that 363 journalists last year were imprisoned. I'm talking around the world. 86 were killed last year alone, according to the UN. And as you say, 33 have been killed just in this conflict. We know here at home we are not immune. We have the highest incidence of online attacks, which have knock-on effects in the physical environment. We've had to remove logos from our trucks. We've had to protect our journalists during demonstrations. We've had to actually begin domestic war zone training. We always have had training for journalists that go into war zones or conflict areas, but now we do it domestically. It is an extremely serious issue. It's why last year we launched the online harm initiative called #NotOK, #CetAssez. I invite you to visit it. It's an open source platform where we developed with all our news colleagues here in Canada a guideline for newsrooms to manage post-traumatic stress syndrome that many of our journalists are suffering from.
Thank you for that, and I certainly hope that member of the Conservative Party will apologize for what are appallingly irresponsible comments. I wanted to come back to Ms. Landsman's questions because the Conservatives have been spreading disinformation. They've never apologized. They've never retracted. They've never clarified their remarks. The attribution of word terrorist, you have correctly pointed out, has been used consistently in CBC coverage. There was the appalling, horrible terrorist attacks that killed over 1,400 Israelis. We're seeing now the horrible civilian casualties in Gaza. I have been watching CBC coverage, and the word terrorist has been used, always attributed, of course, but used consistently. Can you, in a sense, refute Ms. Landsman's contention that the word terrorist has not been used on the CBC network, but that when it has been used, and it's been used frequently, it's always been attributed?
That is correct.
I want to come to the other bit of disinformation, which is the Associated Press article and the headline. Ms. Landsman's correctly identified what the headline says. But CBC has also run other stories that have updated the horrible situation that existed with the hospital in Gaza. So how many articles that have updated and provided information as more information has come out about the role of that Islamic Jihad failed rocket played in killing those people. How many articles have you updated?
Several times, and attributing the UN conclusion and other sources. I would say it's important to understand that in any conflict, context is extremely important. That's why we cite the source in the case of the Palestinian Health Authority, and then according to the Israeli government, or then according to the UN. It's extremely important. Context, especially in a fast-moving situation, is critical. And you cannot look at an article in isolation. You have to look at the body of the work, which is what you're suggesting. There are very many articles that point to a bigger story.
Thank you for that. So it's disinformation to point to one article when there's a series of other articles. And if Ms. Landsman was being honest, she would actually show the evolution of the reporting
and
from
the
CBC on that issue as more information came out, as we've seen with CNN, as we've seen with BBC. Now, you mentioned foreign interference, and this is profoundly disturbing. Last weekend, we learned through Canada Land, which has done terrific work, that a lot of the conservative material, videos, actually don't come from Canada. They come from a shop in Egypt that is financed apparently through the United States. We also know about the Putin regime and its use of the Internet Research Bureau to spread disinformation, false information. You've mentioned foreign interference. To what extent is that part of this sort of coordinated attack on institutions like the CBC? Have you been able to determine to what extent where this foreign interference is coming from that seems to be targeting CBC journalists?
Une courte réponse, s'il vous plaît, Madame Tate.
A very quick answer, please.
Si possible. The reality is that our world has changed. Every day, there are fake CBC and Radio-Canada websites being put up. Every day, we have deep fakes, having a journalist like Ian Hannah-Mansing selling health food products. Each day, we have this kind of infiltration, whether it's from foreign actors, and that particular concern is during federal elections, but also people seeking to make money on the internet. So these bad actors have targeted the most trustworthy, and I really do want to underline for the record that CBC Radio-Canada remains, according to 75% of Canadians, the most trustworthy source of news in this country. So we are spending money on cybersecurity. We are joining our international colleagues at the BBC, at Reuters, all over the world in a trusted news initiative to try to combat an absolute tsunami of disinformation. And what is truly disturbing is when the disinformation is actually coming from our own country. That is the worry. We really need to stand united, arms linked, to fight what is an extremely disturbing trend.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Julian. Le temps est écoulé.
Thank you very much, Mr. Julian. Ms. Tate, I would like to ask a few questions on the topic that is our priority today, especially what Ms. Thomas raised last week. That is, that if CBC and Radio-Canada didn't identify Hamas directly as terrorists, then they were taking the side of the terrorists. There was a report in Israel that Jean-François Bélanger, a Radio-Canada journalist, had his camera ripped away from him. It was a brutal attack. Do you fear an escalation of this kind of violence if we continue to have the type of speech we've seen? Yes, absolutely. You made a connection earlier, and I felt that was very relevant, that you said that CBC Radio vehicles had to have their logo removed because they could be targets of violence. If I could add something, it's not just journalists, it's also the producers, cameramen, the fixers, people that are in other countries that help with interpretation and identifying contacts. So all these people are in danger. We have many of those people in Ukraine and elsewhere helping us. Do you believe that politicians also have a duty and a responsibility? Of course, we have to be accountable. Journalism over the last 20 or 30 years, since the beginning of CNN 30 years ago or so, journalism has become much more direct and in real time, especially in conflict situations. It's hard to identify reliable sources and so on. Do you think that these journalistic practices have contributed to the impression that people get? And I agree with you that politicians have to watch the language that they use. But do you think that journalism has to take stock of the effect of these practices? There is a decline in confidence and trust in just the standard media, and people people depend more on social media, which isn't very reliable. And we know that we see less trust in politicians, in all sorts of institutions. It isn't because of the way journalism is carried out, but I would just say that journalism, public information, has a very important role to play, which isn't the case of airlines, which was another example you gave. So do you not agree? Yes, of course I agree. I'm not making a direct connection between the fact that we have such a fast news cycle and the fact that journalism is under great pressure. We have our journalistic standards and practices. I just want to take a little time on another topic. We talk a lot about CBC and a little less about Radio-Canada, but of course I'm very concerned about Radio-Canada because there are different perspectives, and you won't be surprised to hear that. We hear rumors about tensions within Radio-Canada, and between CBC and Radio-Canada, and that there are different mentalities and attitudes. Do you have the impression that everything is going well within the corporation? Yes, there are very different cultures in Canada, not only for English and French, but others as well, and that's what's interesting about Canada and Canadians. But I can say that things are going well. We agree on the standards and practices, and we have very close cooperation between Ms. Williams and Mr. Melul. Perhaps we could hear from my colleague, Mr. Melul, and Ms. Melul, not just since working in Radio-Canada, but before that, I have seen very close cooperation between Radio-Canada and CBC. We have good discussions and good relations, and I'm sure that's going to continue to be the case. Thank you. My own time is over, and we will now go to the second round of 5 minutes for the Conservatives and the Liberal, and then 2.5 minutes for the Bloc and the NDP. So Ms. Thomas has 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Tate, you said that integrity is of utmost importance to you just a moment ago, and you've referred to it in the journalistic standards as well. I would just return to my colleague's question. You'll see here that this is the article when it was originally published by the CBC. You claim that 90 minutes later it was changed. I have that article title. It's here. This is after 90 minutes. Now, in your journalistic standards, you say that, and I quote, "When we make corrections and clarifications online, we should include on the story page an explanatory note to the audience." Again, I have this article right here, and I don't see an explanatory note. So with the journalistic standard and integrity being so important, why wasn't this done?
My understanding, and again, as Mr. Julian pointed out, there were several other stories that followed those two that if you read the entire thread,
I'm not
you will
holding
see.
those other folks accountable. I'm asking the CBC with regards to your journalistic standards. You say that you're supposed to offer a correction notice. That didn't happen. Why?
Again, I defend the journalism and its independence.
I'm not asking about the journalism.
Yes, but I'm sorry, if I may answer. I would say, if I may answer, our journalists conduct themselves in an independent fashion. I cannot answer the question as to when they post a correction or when they do not. That is their business, and they conduct themselves according to the JSPs.
Ms. Tate,
and
it's
I'm
more
not
than
here
10
to
days
answer.
later. There's no
I'm not
correction.
here to answer on whether or not they corrected a piece of journalism or not. And
So,
again,
Ms.
I
Tate,
would invite you to, if you are concerned about the journalism, I invite you to reach out to the Ombudsman, just as every Canadian has the right to do so, if you do not feel
Chair, I would
that the
invite the member to
journalism
speak
has been
to you
adhered to.
directly and not to me, and perhaps to refrain from raising her voice toward me.
Madame Thomas, j'ai pas l'impression que Madame Tate.
I don't have the impression that she raised her voice, but I do agree that the answers should come through the chair. Thank you, Ms. Tate.
Madame Thomas.
When an article is written blaming Israel for an airstrike that it did not commit, and that has been confirmed by countries around the world and intelligence agencies from around the world, and the CBC still insists that it stands behind that article, professing that the attack did come from Israel. That is, in fact, the spreading of dangerous disinformation. We're inviting you, Ms. Tate, through the chair, to offer an apology to the Jewish population in Canada, and I dare say to all Canadians, because they have $1.4 billion invested in this public broadcaster, and you are right, they do depend on you to tell the truth. So when the truth is not told, when a mistruth is spoken, when disinformation is spread, especially dangerous disinformation like this, an apology seems right. And if not an apology, bare minimum, a correction. Neither of those things have happened. So again, would you apologize to the Jewish population and all Canadians?
No, what I will say, though, is I'm going to quote from the article just for the record. After the first piece, there was a second piece updated that said, Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry said an Israeli airstrike Tuesday hit a Gaza City hospital packed with wounded and other Palestinians seeking shelter, killing hundreds. However, the Israeli military said it had no involvement in the explosion, which it says was caused by a misfired rocket from the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad. I think it speaks for itself.
Yeah, Ms. Tate, thank you. Thank you for, again, admitting that there was dangerous disinformation spread in that article.
I have not admitted that. I'm sorry, I'm correcting the record.
Un rappel au règlement, Monsieur.
I have a point of order.
Line of questioning, and I would ask you, Mr. Chair, to enforce the rules that we have at committee.
Merci, Monsieur Julian, Madame Thomas. Je vous invite à ne pas faire dire à Madame.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. I would invite Ms. Thomas to not say that Ms. Tate said things that she did not.
Mr. Chair, I would give the floor to Landsman, please.
Madam Tate, Hamas itself admits that it uses terrorism to further its goals. Those facts are not disputed, and the choice not to call Hamas terrorists is willful obstruction of the facts. It is bias, and it does help Hamas. That said, Your funding has increased 21%. Your ratings have dropped since 2016. The primetime ratings have dropped 7.6% since 2018. Trust is down 40%. That's a 60% distrust. I will never apologize for holding the CBC to account for $1.4 billion of taxpayer money that you receive. The NDP used to be an opposition party. They used to do that in committee. They used to do that in the House, and I will never apologize for that. But can you tell?
I'm sorry, Ms. Landsman, your time is up. Your 5 minutes is well over. Thank you very much. We will go now to Mr. Noor Mohammed for the Liberals. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're here, Ms. Tate, to talk about your mandate and the importance of that mandate. The leader of the opposition and various members have talked about defunding, eliminating the CBC and that funding. What impact would that have? And what effect would that have on Canadians?
In English, the Conservatives, their leader has promised to defund the CBC to get it its funding. What impact would that have on you delivering on your mandate? What impact would that have on journalism and on Canadian content?
Thank you so much. I beg your pardon. Just to be clear, over the last 30 years, CBC Radio-Canada has not had a real increase in its budget, real dollars aside. We are flat. And yet today, as opposed to just providing traditional linear television radio, we are providing service across a number of digital platforms because that's where Canadians are. Interesting fact, when I started at CBC, the number of people watching traditional television was at about 28%. It has now dropped to 14%. The number of people watching only digital was at about 14%, and now it's in the high 30s. So what we're seeing is a shift to digital. So to defund this organization in a world of extreme polarization, we are the only national news media organization in the country with the mandate to serve all Canadians. And therefore, should we be defunded, we would no longer be reaching all those Canadians.
And if you could briefly tell me, what impact would that have in particular on rural communities?
It would be devastating. We already have, in English Canada, 33 communities with populations of over 50,000 that have no CBC presence. And I just flagged to member Thomas that we were delighted to open a one-person bureau in Lethbridge last year.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. It's a quick question for you on this. I'm just looking at some of the headlines on CBC over the last little while, and one of the headlines reads, Pierre Poilievre's inner circle divided on how to tackle gender issues, sources say. Does that mean that the CBC is saying that the inner circle is divided, or is that saying that sources are saying that?
Sources are saying it.
There is an article that reads with the headline, Ed Fast says Poilievre supporters tried to muzzle him on monetary policy. Is that the CBC saying that Poilievre supporters tried to muzzle Ed Fast, or is that Ed Fast saying that?
That's Ed Fast saying that.
So if I were to read the totality of all of the stories that were written in respect of the tragedy at the hospital in Gaza, I would just start with the letter that Ms. Thomas and Ms. Landsman have referred to, and then I would continue to read all of the articles that have been written. What conclusion would a reasonable person reach?
That the CBC and Radio-Canada are reporting on the facts and on the sources that they have received on the ground or through other reputable news organizations.
And why does the CBC, or why does any credible journalist, indicate who their source is?
Because otherwise we would be in the business of opinion.
And if you were in the business of opinion, how would that make you different from journalists?
Well,
I'm asking these questions because I think it's really important for Canadians to understand the difference between presenting
no, and
facts,
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. But
presenting sources and presenting opinions.
It is extremely, I go back to the 5 guiding principles: impartiality, fairness, balance, accuracy, and integrity.
And with the time I have left, which I believe is
40 seconds.
40 seconds, I would like to talk about accuracy for a moment. What is the degree of confidence that you have in the accuracy of the work and the quality of the work of our journalists at CBC and Radio-Canada, particularly in areas of conflict?
I think that we are the most outstanding, high-quality journalistic organization in this country. I have enormous pride in the work that our journalists do, and we are the only journalistic organization that has any level of presence internationally, and even then it's rather inadequate. But we do that work with extraordinary care. Our purpose is the public interest, first and foremost.
Merci, Monsieur Noor Mohamed.
Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohamed. Mr. Julian, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a situation here where the comments by the Conservatives are out of line, and they are putting our journalists in danger. So what steps have you taken to support the journalists who are on the front lines in the Middle East right now? And can you talk about the situation as it has evolved over the last 5 years? We have and awards that they've received. They've received hundreds of awards. We are recognized by our colleagues in Canada, but also around the world.
Journalist organization to receive the Trusted News certification by Reporters Without Borders. The first question was...
C'était à propos des menaces qui sont posées.
About the threats to journalists. Well, it is, as I said, we do a lot of work to train our journalists, to prepare them, and we offer that training to other organizations in the private sector. So they don't have the means to provide it, and so we provide it to them. So to our own journalists, but also to private sector journalists, to prepare them for conflict zones and other dangerous situations.
You've pointed out, and Conservatives have to admit, that there have been a series of articles in the evolution after the explosions at the hospital that have clearly indicated, as more information came out, where that information is coming from, whether it's the U.S. or the United Nations. But if somebody said, well, I still don't like that article being in the archives, even though CBC has updated it with new articles, if they didn't like seeing that CBC article in the archives, what is open to that Canadian to do? I mean, with Fox, they can't do a thing because Fox has no ombudsman process.
No.
But what can somebody who's concerned about something like that, an old article that they don't like, what can they do?
Réponse, Madame Tate, parce qu'il reste le temps est écoulé.
Ms. Tate, I'm afraid the time is about up, so 10 seconds, please.
If they don't like anything they see on any of our journalism, but first and foremost, they can reach out to the ombudsman en français ou en anglais and indicate their concern. The ombudsman operates independently from management and, in fact, reports directly to the board and the public on a biannual basis and reports on any errors or concerns in the journalism. And
Merci.
That is entirely public.
Merci, Madame Tate.
Thank you, Ms. Tate. I would just like to ask a question about the process for independence and how you prevent the newsroom from being subject to any pressure from management or elsewhere. I would like to know how that wall actually works between the journalists and management. For example, the executive committee. There must be an executive for the news portion. I would imagine they must have an ideological position in CBC or Radio-Canada. So when they're having their meetings, that must come out and it must be translated through the policy. So how do you have a protection against that? I can certainly tell you that our executives fiercely protect that independence, and my colleagues here can vouch for that. We have a board. We have a board of directors, and we make sure that we respect that independence. If we have a comment, then certainly we will be told that that is not acceptable. So, Ms. Thomas, you now have 5 minutes on our third round.
Melissa Lansman, please.
C'est à moi. Merci.
C'est bien, Madame Lansman.
I'm just going to go back. The funding increases for the CBC have been 21% since 2016. That's $1.4 billion of taxpayer money. The trust score has gone down. And by your own principles outlined on the CBC website, what you discussed, impartiality, fairness, balance, integrity, can you tell Canadians who expect those principles to be upheld why the state-funded broadcaster sued the Conservative Party in the middle of the 2019 election while covering that party? By the way, you lost the lawsuit, and our taxpayers are on the hook for the costs. But why should Canadians trust you?
If I may, Mr. Chair, I just want to correct the record on the on our budget of $1.4 billion is a very significant sum of money, but I just want to put it into perspective that France Télévisions and Radio France receive 4 billion euros for a population not 67 million or so, and one time zone, one language. We are providing service in 2 official languages, 8 Indigenous languages across 6 time zones with a funding of $33 per capita per year. That's less than a dime a day. And we also earn commercial
I understand,
revenue.
Ms. Tate, you don't believe that you get enough money. My question was about why you sued the Conservative Party in the middle of the 2019 election. And if you have an answer, that's fine. And if not, I'll pass the time over to Ms. Thomas, who maybe can ask you that same question that you won't answer.
It's not that I didn't want to answer. I wanted to correct the record on the funding. The purpose of the public broadcaster is to present all news in the most, as you've heard, in the most fact-based, accurate, balanced way possible. We object to the use of our journalism, whether it's clips, sound bites, or photographs of our journalists, when they are manipulated and used by political parties for their political ends. That was the substance of our concern. It continues to be a concern. Do we wish to sue any political party? Absolutely not. But we absolutely have to protect not only the appearance of independence, but the reality of independence. And so, therefore, we will always protect that journalism.
Well, not all political parties, just some. Madam Thomas?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Madam Tate seems to like to correct the record here, but unfortunately doesn't ensure that the record is corrected for the sake of the Canadian public, who is investing $1.4 billion taxpayer dollars annually into the CBC and, of course, wanting unbiased and reliable news coverage. She stated that trust is of utmost importance, but obviously telling the truth doesn't fit into her definition of gaining the Canadians' trust. Jesus. My question for Ms. Tate is this.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, point of order. Just a point of order on this. I just want to be clear with what I heard. I believe Ms. Thomas accused the witness of lying, and I just want to make sure that that's not what happened, because if it is, I think you as the chair, I would humbly request that you perhaps ask Ms. Thomas to take back her words and to reconsider what she is saying.
Madame Thomas, est-ce que vous avez entendu?
Ms. Thomas, did you hear the request by your colleague, Mr. Noor Mohammed? Would you retract what your words and to perhaps change your approach a little bit in your question?
Thank you, Chair. The question that I have for Ms. Tate is to do with my
point of
colleague,
order.
Ms. Lansman.
Monsieur Julian a un point. Un rappel au règlement.
Mr. Julian, please.
Has a long experience. She knows what she just said was incredibly unparliamentary, inappropriate for this committee, inappropriate in every way. And so, yes, you have asked her to retract, and I believe she should. This is a parliamentary committee. It's not some kind of street brawl, and it is really unfortunate. I know the Conservatives are frustrated because
Merci, Monsieur Julian.
they have been saying things that are...
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Ms. Thomas, yes, I would ask you to please use the word that you used, and I think that it was not very parliamentary of you in your approach to her. Thank you. You have a couple of minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Shampoo. Of course, that was not what I was intending to say, but the Censorship Coalition, of course, will try to silence my voice and interrupt as much as possible. With regards to Ms. Lansman's question concerning the lawsuit that was put out by the CBC or undertaken by the CBC toward the end of the 2019 election, it seems like a bit of a suspicious time to launch that. Nevertheless, it was unsuccessful. The courts did, in fact, determine that it was within the right of the Conservative Party of Canada to take footage provided by a public broadcaster and to use it within its frame of reference. And so I wonder then, why on earth would the public broadcaster, the CBC, undertake this case only a few days before the end of an election? I mean, right in the middle of a federal election, when in fact the CBC claims to want to be independent and truthful and to function with integrity. That doesn't seem to be the case in this instance. Again, the court has determined that the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, was in the right to use this footage. Was this just gamesmanship on behalf of the CBC?
I just would like to clarify. I would like to clarify that this is not the only political party that we have had to take action on. It went further than any.
Mr. Chair, I would just ask that you would kindly ask the witness to answer the question.
Madame Thomas, je vais accorder quelques...
Ms. Thomas, I will just give a few more seconds to Ms. Tate, but your time is up.
Said the political case or the legal case in the case of the Conservative Party is not the only time that we've had to take injunctions. We've done that to the NDP and to the Liberal Party as well. We are here to protect our journalism.
Mr. Chair,
Madame.
it was
Merci,
in the
Madame
middle of an
Thomas.
election.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Thank you. Your time is well over. Thank you, Ms. Thomas. The last turn goes to the Liberals, Ms. Gainey. Thank you, and thank you for being here today. I would like to go back, if we could, to your next strategic plan.
23, just earlier this year, signaling plans to shift your content to digital services. And I believe that's what you were referencing in your 3 priorities as well with respect to your strategic plan. So I'm curious if you could unpack a little bit more for us that of the 3 commitments. If we have time, I'd also be curious to hear about the first one regarding Indigenous, the Indigenous framework that you're also working on.
Well, that's a big morsel to unpack. What I would say on our strategic approach, as Canadians have shifted to digital, we have followed them as best we can, but we are not leaving behind any of our deeply devoted television and radio watchers and listeners. Obviously, radio is a hugely powerful connector in this country, especially during times of climate emergencies, as we saw this summer with the fires. So that shift to digital takes a great deal of investment, and it also allows us to reach younger audiences, which is extremely important to the future of democracy in this country. We need young people to be engaged in civic, civil discourse. And that is what the public broadcaster is trying to promote. With respect to the Indigenous framework, as I said earlier, we have an obligation to serve all Canadians, and that includes the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of this country. What is fantastically exciting about the work we've done over the last 2 years is that we've come to a place where not only will we be increasing the amount of Indigenous created and produced content on our network, but we've made a commitment to ensure that our employee base and our leadership teams have greater representation from Indigenous peoples.
Deux minutes et demie, Madame Guény.
You still have 2.5 minutes.
I lost my thought there. Did you have another question, Tal?
Thank you. I would like to go back to you started talking about foreign interference and how that is the implications of that for journalists on the ground. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit more. And also, do you know how many other Canadian news organizations are actually on the ground in the Middle East right now? Is it just CBC or are there others?
Well, with respect to others on the ground, I know, maybe Barb could provide it because of her background with Global. I know Global and CTV have people. Côté français, je sais pas.
Au début du conflit nouveau, donc Bell Media avait quelques personnes, mais je pense...
There are others as well, but not very many.
Yeah, you're right. On the English side, Global's there, CTV is there. There are others there. I think we've been able to have a longer and more dedicated presence in the Middle East, as well as in Ukraine, as well as we have foreign bureaus in other parts of the world that the other English news organizations haven't been able to be there in as permanent or as widespread a way as we have.
Quels sont les risques aux Canadiens?
What are the risks to Canadians if the funds are cut to CBC and Radio-Canada? What is the risk to our democracy? It's a very great risk because CBC, Radio-Canada, without it, we would have a great deal of disconnection because we have such a vast country. It's difficult to have common values, common interests. There would not be a French service for Francophones outside Quebec, and the same thing for people in the north. There wouldn't be a connection. We are part of the life of those people, and so it is a very important connective link. 20 seconds only.
A reporter on the ground now in Lethbridge. I know in Hamilton, our town, there is a really strong CBC team that is fully digital but can transition to other platforms as well. How important are those digital teams to Canadians?
It's the future. I mean, what we did coming out of COVID, we had some savings from travel because no one was traveling, and we put it right into local journalism. We sent Juanita Taylor to represent a national show, and now she's in Rankin Inlet, reporting from the north. Lethbridge, Cranbrook, Grand Prairie, Nanaimo, Hamilton. We have a digital studio in London, Ontario. This is the future, much more mobile. Du côté francophone, on a des vidéos.
On the French side, we have a mobile app and services.
More flexible, getting out of the station and getting close to Canadians. That's what matters.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Hefner.
Thank you very much. And I would like just to ask Ms. Tate whether you have a few more minutes for one more. Can we go to 9:30 and have another round of questions? Would the Conservatives like to have a question in this round? Ms. Thomas?
5 minutes, Madame.
5 minutes. If you are ready, Ms. Thomas.
Laissez-moi valider.
Yes, I just want to check with Ms. Tate. Do we have time for a full turn of 10 minutes? Yes, so we'll do a third turn. So once again, we'll have 5 minutes for the Conservatives and 5 for the Liberals, and then 2.5 minutes each for the Bloc and the NDP, and so on. So, Ms. Thomas, if you would like, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. In the spring, Twitter determined that they would attach a label to public broadcasters, and they did this across the board. And the CBC, of course, had this done to its profile, and so it had a label that said "government-funded broadcaster" attached to it. And when interviewed, the CBC said that this was a threat to journalistic independence. This is curious to me because to have it announced that public dollars were being received and used by the CBC was somehow a threat to journalistic independence. And yet Ms. Tate has contended here today that receiving government money is not a threat to journalistic independence. And so I'm confused as to which one it is. On the one hand, when Twitter makes it public that government dollars, $1.4 billion, are being received by this organization to put out news, it is all of a sudden a threat to journalistic independence. But if a Conservative was to bring that up, then no, it is not a threat to journalistic independence. My question to Ms. Tate is, if the CBC was given the opportunity to be truly independent and set free from the shackles of government money, would they be okay? Would they continue to provide Canadians with news?
It would be extremely difficult to provide news to many of the underserved communities, rural communities, your own community, Lethbridge, the North, Francophones living in minority communities across the country. We would not have sufficient funding because the reason there is no commercial private news in those communities is because it's not economically viable. So we have the privilege and the honor of serving Canadians in those communities using the public funding that we receive.
So when 100% of the CBC's budget is dependent on dollars being given out by the federal government, that would mean that there's dependence there, which is to say the opposite of independence. When the CBC CEO, the president, Ms. Tate, just said to me that they would not be able to provide the coverage without that money, again, that says that they are beholden by the government. They cannot survive without the government dollars, which means then that it's hard to believe that the news coverage is entirely independent. And so I'm curious as to how the CBC can then claim to be independent if they can't survive without the government dollars.
Well, I should just correct the record. Our funding is not 100% government. We also have
Ms. Tate, I didn't say funding. I said budget. Your budget is 100%.
No, it is not. No, it is not. Our budget is $1.8 billion. The balance is earned revenue from advertising and subscription. So we have
$1.4 billion taxpayer dollars.
Plus another $400 million in earned revenue. And we manage that budget as best we can to deliver the maximum service across the country.
Sorry, the question was, how can you assure Canadians that you're functioning independently when, in fact, the CBC is reliant on government dollars?
I believe
the CBC took offense to Twitter attaching this label that they do, in fact, receive government dollars. And the CBC admitted that receiving those dollars, I quote, threatens journalistic independence.
If I may, on the Twitter issue, Mr. Chair, it was the accompanying Elon Musk diatribe that described government equals state-funded. And in a global environment that I have described, where 80% of the population of the planet
To be clear, Mr. Chair, just to clear the record, because I know Ms. Tate appreciates cleaning records, the label attached was government-funded.
Correct.
Not state-funded, government-funded.
That is correct, but if you read the diatribe of Elon Musk, you would know that what he was talking about was state-funded. And CBC Radio
Again,
Canada...
the label was government-funded.
Point of order.
Monsieur Julian, sur un rappel au règlement.
A point of order.
Not allowing the witness to answer the question it is, again, very unparliamentary. Mrs. Thomas knows this. If you could ask Mr. Chair that she respects the parliamentary rules.
Merci, Monsieur Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Julian.
Madame Tate peut compléter sa réponse.
You have 30 seconds.
To object to this labeling. It was a move and a campaign on the part of Elon Musk to, talking about badgering, to call any broadcaster, public broadcaster, and all our colleagues, ZDF, BBC, France Télévisions, New Zealand, Australia, all of the public broadcasters were attacked in this way. It was extremely important for us to clarify which we did.
Is an attack?
Merci, Madame Thomas.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Thank you, Ms. Tate. Your 5 minutes is over, and now we will go to Mr. Noor Mohammed. You have 5 minutes on behalf of the Liberals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A couple of questions for you, and then I'm going to share my time. My first question is, are you aware that other media outlets like the National Post in Canada receive government subsidy or government funding?
Yes.
Does that make them beholden to the position of the Government of Canada?
No.
Can they maintain whatever independence they feel they are maintaining and still receive government funding?
Yes.
Did you know that the Conservative Party received Government of Canada COVID subsidies during COVID?
Yes.
Do you think that that makes them beholden to the point of view of the Government of Canada?
No.
Is it fair to assume that a logical person could say then that the CBC receiving money from the Government of Canada could also maintain its independence?
Correct.
Is that a reasonable assumption?
Especially with the protections that we have in place, the JSPs and all the levels of management up to the government, all of those checkpoints for independence and the existence of our ombudsman.
So for avoidance of doubt, it is possible for organizations to receive government funding and still be independent?
Correct.
Thank you. Ms. Tate, Monsieur le Président, I will share my time with Mr. Julian.
Oh, Monsieur Julian, vous avez les...
Mr. Julian, you have 3 minutes and 45 seconds left over from the Liberals' time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I wanted to ask Ms. Tate, it has recently come out, of course, that Meta and Google receive over $1 billion of indirect subsidies. The Conservatives have never said a word of that. Over $1 billion. That's a ton of money. Are you aware of that? Do you think that Meta and Google in some way bend to government will with that over $1 billion in indirect subsidies?
I think they're demonstrating quite the contrary.
Yes, yeah. So I think what's clear, Mr. Chair, is the Conservative attack or rage machine kind of fell on the rocks today. They ran out of questions and simply were not able to...
And point of order.
The statements that he's making, the words he's using about the Conservative Party, labeling. Thank you.
And, Mr. Chair, I respect Mr. Shields, and I will withdraw. And Mrs. Thomas should be doing the same thing with her despicable attacks against CBC journalists and some of her comments today. So, Mr. Chair, given that we are nearing the end, I certainly appreciate the extra time that was given. I want to move the following motion. It was circulated as a notice of motion, that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage affirms that CBC Radio Canada journalists and crew members are risking their lives every day in the Middle East, covering the Israel-Hamas conflict and the horrific events impacting Israelis and Palestinians, that CBC Radio Canada journalists have received or been nominated for over 200 prestigious national journalism awards in the past 5 years, such as the Canadian Association of Journalists Awards, Radio, Television, Digital News Association National Awards, the National Native Media Awards, and National Association of Black Journalists Awards, And finally, that the independence of CBC Radio-Canada journalists from political interference is protected in the Broadcasting Act, Section 46(5), which states that the corporation shall, in pursuit of its objects and in the exercise of its power, enjoy freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence.
Merci, Monsieur
Thank you, Mr. Julian. With all due respect, I would first ask the committee's permission to thank Ms. Tate and also her two colleagues, Ms. Williams and Ms. Milul, and let them leave. I want to thank all three of them before we get into the debate on the motion. Thank you for answering all the questions, even the most difficult. So your attendance today has been very much appreciated. We can now begin to debate Mr. Julian's motion. Mr. Julian, you can speak to this first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I mean, it's very clear from the testimony today, and I will say again, the Conservatives just basically ran out of speed, given the fact that the facts were very clearly affirmed.
Monsieur Julian, un rappel au règlement.
Mr. Julian, we have a point of order.
Spend until the witnesses leave the room, then we go into camera.
That's reasonable. Yeah.
Absolument, tout à fait. Vous avez bien raison.
Absolutely. We will just suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes.
Alors, on reprend et c'est...
We will resume our meeting, and Mr. Julian has the floor to discuss his motion. Mr. Julian, please.
Mr. Chair, I don't intend to go long on this. We've been experiencing a Conservative filibuster for the past month, and you'll recall that Conservatives were saying they needed 3 hours with the CBC president on Israel-Hamas, and after half an hour, they stopped asking questions about Israel-Hamas. So very, very clearly, that was wasted time. I believe that we need to come back to the important committee report, which is on safe sports. Witnesses believe that we need to move forward on that, and it's been delayed for a month because of these incessant filibusters from the Conservatives. So I'm not going to take a lot of time on this. The Conservatives gave up after half an hour to ask about Israel-Hamas. The reality is, I think it's because of the strength of the facts that are on CBC's side. The facts are that they are risking their lives every day in the Middle East, covering the Israel-Hamas conflict. The truth is, the facts are that CBC Radio Canada have received or been nominated for over 200 prestigious national journalism awards in the last 5 years. These are the top journalist prize, and they are prizes because the journalism has been factual, it has been updated. The CBC news organization does everything that a news organization should do, and uphold the international standards that we also see reflected in CNN and BBC, Agence France Presse. It's not at all the approach of the Fox Entertainment Network that makes things up, and they've admitted in numerous court cases that they just make up stuff. And yet that seems to be the model that some members of this committee want to see. But most importantly, Mr. Chair, the final clause, that the independence of CBC, protecting that from political interference, is actually something that was adopted by this Parliament. In the Broadcasting Act, Section 46(5), which states that the corporation shall, in pursuit of its objects and the exercise of its power, enjoy freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence. That is vitally important. The idea that the Fox Entertainment model, where you can make stuff up all the time, is not the approach that Canadians want to see. They want to see profound journalistic endeavor. The reality is, if anybody in Canada doesn't like something like an article that is archived on the site, has been updated by numerous other articles, but they don't like the original article, they can appeal to the Ombudsman. There's a process. That journalistic independence is protected, but the public can weigh in. Canadians can weigh in. As we've heard, over $1 billion in indirect subsidies go to Meta and Google. We've seen numerous subsidies going to big business. What CBC does in return for the public subsidy is ensure the top level of journalistic credibility, and that over 200 prestigious national journalism awards attest to that. Alors, Monsieur le Président,
So, Mr. Chairman, since CBC Radio Canada has received over 200 distinguished prizes, and there is no interference that should be allowed by parliamentarians. We need to protect the journalists that are on the ground in danger, and I think that we need to adopt this motion. Thank you, Mr. Julian. Before going to other speakers, I just want to clarify any doubts that there might be. We have remained in public. We will not go in camera because we are discussing this motion. We are still on the same point, studying this report. So we remain in public. So Ms. Thomas, Mr. Gladue, Mr. Shields, and Mr. Noor Mohammed. Please go ahead, Ms. Thomas.
Thank you very much. I would simply offer an amendment to Mr. Julian's motion that after or in addition to, at the end of his motion, it would read that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage affirms that the CBC published a false headline based on disinformation from Hamas, a criminal terrorist organization, that incorrectly stated Israel was responsible for the explosion at Al-Ahli Hospital in Gaza that resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians, and that the committee call on the CBC to apologize to the Jewish community and all Canadians for spreading this dangerous disinformation, and to publicly correct the record and to report this finding to the House of Commons. I am happy to send that amendment to the clerk for it to be translated into French and made available to the members at the table.
Pendant que vous faites ça, Madame Thomas, on va suspendre la réunion pour...
While you do that, Ms. Thomas, we will suspend the meeting.
va reprendre la réunion.
Okay, we're resuming our meeting. Colleagues, I just want to inform you that we are still waiting for the French translation of the amendment, which has not arrived yet. We have this room until 10:30. If we have the translation of the amendment before that time, we can then decide if we want to suspend or end the meeting, adjourn it. But we are still adjourned. I have a point of order. Unfortunately, I have another committee that I have to go to, so I would like to move the adjournment. That isn't a point of order, I don't believe, Mr. Julian. I'm not used to being right so often. In fact, you can't move adjournment on a point of order. Ms. Gladue.
Yes, Chair. I had my hand up to speak to the motion, and then I wanted to speak to the amendment, so I sort of lowered my hand and raised my hand, but it's kind of hard virtually to be sure that you're really getting on both lists. So I just want to make sure I'm on both lists.
Madame Gladue, vous avez bien raison de faire la...
You're quite right, Ms. Gladue. I'm glad you mentioned that because when we took up the amendment, I did want to start a new list for people to speak to the amendment. Mr. Noor Mohammed would like to speak. I just want to clarify something, Mr. Chair.
Then if we suspend the meeting, we come back to where we were when we come back. If we adjourn the meeting, we go back to committee business, correct?
Tout à fait, oui.
Oui.
Vous avez raison.
So, yes, that's right.
Mr. Julian, so if we are currently suspended, and Mr. Julian has to go, and we also have to go to other committees and our meetings, can we adhere to the time of the committee, suspend this meeting, depart, and then recommence where we were through?
Point of order.
Monsieur Aboultaïf.
If you allow me to explain this, the order was the meeting was on suspend basically. The chair came and called the meeting before the clock ends, and there's a motion to adjourn from Mr. Julian, and that basically should be taken into place.
Là-dessus, Monsieur Aboultaïf, je vous...
So, Mr. Aboultaïf, Mr. Julian asked for the adjournment on a point of order, which cannot be done, and therefore we don't have an official call for adjournment. So we will return to our suspension until the translation of the amendment is ready. Another point of order, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, you are a great chair, but I want to say that I need to challenge your decision. Conventionally, we do allow motions for adjournment on a point of order. I certainly give you leave to challenge the decision, but I want to just point out that I followed the advice of my clerk. And 33 years ago, Jacques was called to the bar. So you want to challenge my decision and that of my colleague. So Geneviève will vote on this challenge to the chair's decision. So should it be upheld or overturned? We are going to now vote on the decision. Mr. Cotto.
I will uphold the decision of the chair.
Ms. Dillon.
What does that mean?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? The vote is on the challenge to the chair. So vote yay, you agree with the chair, and nay means you overrule the decision of the chair.
Yay. No,
Madame Gainey.
sorry, no.
Madame Gainey.
No.
Ms. Hefner.
No.
Mr. Noor Mohammed. Mrs. Thomas. Mrs. Thomas?
Sorry, just to clarify, sorry, so the chair is saying that we are simply going to suspend and then return to business. That is the chair's ruling, correct?
The ruling was that a motion to adjourn cannot be proposed on a point of order, and that is the decision that is being challenged. So if you agree with the chair, you would vote yay, and then there would not be a motion to adjourn. If you vote nay, then you disagree, and the motion to adjourn would stand.
I vote nay.
Ms. Gladue?
No.
Mr. Shields? No. Mr. Aboultaif?
No.
Mr. Julian?
No. But I wanted to add que je trouve le président excellent en tout temps.
I think we have an excellent chair.
Yeas, 8 nays.
Alors, la décision.
So the chair's decision is overturned, and this is a very sad way for me to end my role as a chair of this replacing chair. And so I want to thank all of my colleagues for their wonderful support, and Geneviève and Jacques, our clerks, have done a fantastic job. Thanks to the analysts and the interpreters. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, all of you.